He walked in just after 10, not loud, not hurried, dressed in a clean gray coat and carrying a plastic bag with careful hands, the kind of entrance that should have meant nothing, but somehow it meant everything. The moment his shoes touched the polished tile, the air changed. He wasn't greeted. He wasn't acknowledged. He was measured, like a weight on a scale that had already decided what he couldn't possibly be. It started with a delay, then a misplaced form, then a pencil too worn to use. But none of it seemed accidental. Each step was wrapped in procedure, every glance sharpened by something unspoken. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't push back. He simply stood, watched, waited. And what unfolded over the next hours wasn't a banking transaction. It was a slow, relentless unraveling of dignity, witnessed by a room full of silence. But no one asked who he was. No one wondered why he endured it all without leaving, until someone else walked in. Someone who looked past the coat, past the silence, past the bag. And in that moment, everything turned. If you're drawn to stories that dig beneath the surface, that hold a mirror to what justice really means and how power can hide in plain sight, like and subscribe for the full journey. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you think might be hiding in plain view. This is only the beginning. The doors to Sterling First Bank opened with a smooth glide of engineered wealth, the kind of quiet that cost millions to install. Every detail inside whispered exclusivity, the marble tiles beneath a fresh coat of polish, the brass nameplates, the subtle scent of lemon oil drifting from the polished counters. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. That silence, sharp and cold, was the bank's way of reminding visitors where they stood. And on that day, as the winter wind whispered outside, Malcolm Roach stepped into that silence like he didn't belong in it. He wore a pale green windbreaker zipped up to the base of his throat, clean but visibly worn, the color faded from years of weather and washing. His khakis were pressed but frayed slightly at the ankle, revealing gray cotton socks over plain black sneakers. In his hand, he carried a white plastic bag, doubled up at the handle. Inside were neatly folded documents, his updated account information, a certified check, and 2 forms of government-issued ID. The bag rustled slightly with each step as he moved into the queue, a single figure adrift in the hush of wealth. Lorraine Baxter stood at the center desk, her posture perfect, blonde hair coiled in a tight twist that hadn't moved since 8 o'clock. She wore a slim dark blouse and red lipstick that didn't smudge, not even when she sipped her 3rd coffee that morning. Her eyes scanned the line with mechanical efficiency until they landed on Malcolm. She didn't frown. That would have been too obvious. She simply tightened her mouth, reached for a slip of paper, and flicked her wrist slightly, just enough to gesture him toward the desk near the entryway. It was the one marked for standard inquiries and basic transactions. Malcolm glanced behind him, then looked back at her, unsure. She didn't speak, just pointed again, then turned her eyes back to her screen, ending the interaction before it ever began. Malcolm hesitated, then followed the gesture to the lower desk. It was empty, manned earlier by a college intern who now appeared to be on break. He stood politely at the edge, his fingers tightening slightly around the plastic bag. Lorraine continued assisting other clients, 2 couples in business suits, a young man with a silver watch who received a warm smile. Minutes passed, then more. A man who had entered after Malcolm walked out with a completed cashier's check in hand. No one approached him. The intern didn't return. The bank speakers played light classical music at an almost insulting volume, soft piano notes that sounded cheerful and sterile at the same time. Malcolm finally turned back toward Lorraine's desk and took a tentative step forward. She looked up mildly annoyed and asked if she could help him. He explained in a calm and precise voice that he had a certified check and some forms regarding an older account he'd reactivated. He said he'd like to deposit it today and ensure the account was ready for upcoming transfers. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, then extended one manicured hand toward the bag. He pulled out the envelope carefully and laid it flat on the counter. Lorraine opened it, flipped through the forms with her fingernails, and squinted at the check. Her lips twisted as if something smelled off. Then she closed the folder and tapped it against the counter. "We're going to need additional documentation," she said. "Something verifying your employment, proof of check origin, and your original account opening form." Malcolm replied that the check was issued by a state institution, backed by court documents, and his account was already verified last month by a regional manager. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she pulled out a laminated sheet from beneath her keyboard and began reading off a list of items she claimed were required for large deposits from unverified entities. Malcolm stayed silent. He had been through processes like this before, but it was the way she emphasized unverified that stung, not as a technical term, but as a personal judgment. Still, he complied. He retrieved a second ID from his wallet, set it beside the first, and remained standing as she examined both. She picked them up, walked away to the copier without another word. He waited and waited. 10 minutes. 15. He stood with his hands clasped lightly in front of him, posture straight, back aching just slightly from the draft near the door. Two younger employees whispered near the printer station, glanced his way, then went silent when he turned. Lorraine returned eventually, slid his IDs back toward him, then told him he could wait on the bench until they got confirmation from the back. Malcolm nodded, gathered his documents, and took a seat beside a large potted fern that hadn't been watered in days. From that bench, he watched Lorraine greet the next client with a grin. The client, a tall man in a navy wool coat and leather gloves, was greeted by name. Lorraine offered him tea. The man laughed. Malcolm sat still, knees close together, hands resting over the plastic bag in his lap. His stomach rumbled softly, but he ignored it. Across the lobby, another teller began closing a client folder with a pleasant farewell. A group of executives passed through toward the upstairs offices, their polished shoes clicking like metronomes. Malcolm adjusted his collar. 30 minutes. He rose again and returned to the counter. Lorraine barely glanced at it, her mouth pulled tight, her nostrils flaring just enough to signal distaste without expressing anything concrete. It was a look she'd perfected, subtle enough to keep her blameless, but sharp enough that the person across the counter could feel it. She lifted the envelope like it was evidence in a contamination trial, pinched at one corner, and let it hover above her keyboard for a moment before sliding it underneath a stack of bright blue promotional flyers, junk mail she had already planned to throw out. Without a word, she opened a drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a disinfectant wipe. The lemon-scented chemical smell filled the air as she carefully cleaned the space where the envelope had touched, scrubbing the counter with slow, deliberate circles while Malcolm stood in silence. When she finally looked up, she made no apology, no explanation. She simply told him he could have a seat while she reviewed his documents. He started to respond, but her eyes had already shifted to the next person in line, a woman in a high-end wool coat and pearl earrings, who was greeted with warmth and a smile that revealed perfectly even teeth. Lorraine asked how her husband was doing, if their trip to Aspen had gone well, then began assisting her with a wire transfer request. Malcolm turned away slowly, walked to the nearest bench again, and sat down. This time, he did not place the bag beside him. He kept it in his lap, one hand resting over it while the other fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve. The bank's atmosphere hadn't changed, calm, cold, meticulously organized. But to Malcolm, it was starting to feel more like a waiting room for judgment than a place of financial transaction. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The woman with the pearl earrings completed her transaction and left with a smile. Lorraine called the next client, a man in business casual who seemed to know her well. They shared a quick laugh about someone they both disliked in corporate. Behind the glass office, the assistant branch manager paced with a clipboard. No one looked at Malcolm. No one asked him if he had been helped. When he stood again, it was slow, careful, his knees protesting slightly as he crossed the floor and returned to the counter. Lorraine didn't flinch when he arrived. She looked at him, not like she was seeing a man, but like she was staring at a procedural error. He cleared his throat gently and asked if there had been any update. She replied that she was still evaluating the check. Malcolm nodded once, said nothing more, then asked if she could clarify what needed verification. She replied with a list that changed from the one she had mentioned earlier. This time, she included a real-time clearing certificate, a vague term that banks didn't commonly use outside of international corporate deposits. Malcolm asked if that requirement was standard for certified checks from county-issued accounts. Lorraine didn't answer the question. Instead, she asked him to sit again while she contacted a regional processing desk. She picked up her phone, dialed number, and turned her chair slightly to face away from him, her voice soft enough that he couldn't hear. After several moments of nodding and murmuring, she placed the phone down and resumed working on another transaction, without so much as glancing at him again. Malcolm did not sit. Not this time. He stayed there, standing at the counter like a ghost in an active scene. Another teller glanced at him and looked away. One of the bank's junior officers walked past, gave him a polite nod, but didn't stop. Lorraine continued typing, her fingers moving with calm indifference. Then, finally, she pulled the envelope back out from under the flyers, opened it again, and extracted the documents. She studied them as if seeing them for the first time, then asked him if he had an original issuance statement for the check. Malcolm replied evenly that the check itself contained all necessary details, including the issuing institution's routing, authorization code, and processing dates. She said she needed something more formal. When he asked what that meant, she gave no answer. Instead, she reached for a slip of paper and began filling out a document request form, a generic sheet typically used for clients with no documentation or expired records. Malcolm's jaw tensed slightly, but he remained composed. He reached into the plastic bag again, pulled out another page, a printout of the issuing agency's letterhead with a confirmation notice, and handed it to her. She didn't look at it. She added the form to the growing pile and placed them all into a dull brown folder that bore no label. Then she asked him to step aside because she needed the counter for the next customer. This time, her voice was firm, final. Malcolm moved. He returned to the bench. The sun had lowered further now, casting long shadows across the lobby floor. The jazz had been replaced with silence between tracks. The bank's traffic had slowed, but no one had come to him with updates. No one returned the envelope. No one asked if he needed water or rest. Malcolm leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, eyes on the gray rubber base of a velvet rope line. He watched as customers entered and left, most greeted warmly, some even by name. Lorraine stood like a gatekeeper with a smile reserved only for those who looked like they belonged. Her posture remained impeccable, her tone charming with anyone who came wearing a pressed shirt or polished shoes. Yet with Malcolm, she had spoken less than 50 words in nearly an hour and a half. He was still in the windbreaker, still holding the plastic bag with his paperwork, still trying to be patient in a space that had already made its position clear. The bag had grown warm in his hands from being held so long. It now felt heavier, not from weight, but from weariness. When he finally stood to stretch, trying not to groan as his knees cracked slightly, Lorraine's voice pierced the lobby with artificial concern. "Sir, please remain seated until someone is ready to assist you," she said, loud enough to turn at least 6 heads. Her voice wasn't angry. It was performative, polite but stiff, the kind used to reprimand a child in public while pretending you're being fair. Malcolm didn't speak. He merely lowered his head slightly and returned to the bench, this time keeping his hands folded tightly in his lap. A woman across the lobby, seated by the mortgage office, gave him a quick glance, then turned away, pretending to check her phone. Lorraine resumed typing, but not before muttering something to the teller beside her, a younger woman named Paige who looked over at Malcolm with narrowed eyes. Lorraine gestured with a tilt of her head, then whispered something else, just barely audible, about scuff belts and counterfeit behavior. The words weren't spoken as statements, but as suggestions, loaded with implication. Paige nodded slowly, then reached for her headset and adjusted the earpiece, saying nothing but clearly understanding the message. Malcolm couldn't hear the words exactly, but he could read the expressions. He had seen them before, too many times to count. There was no policy in place that said men who looked like him had to prove themselves twice, but the invisible rules were always in effect. He glanced down at his belt, realizing the leather had cracked around the second loop, and he wondered for a moment whether that tiny detail had been her ammunition all along. She didn't have to call him anything. She didn't have to insult him. All she needed was to treat him like he didn't belong, let the other staff fill in the rest with their own assumptions. When the branch manager passed by, Lorraine turned to speak quickly, casually, as if reporting a minor concern. She pointed toward Malcolm with her chin. The manager didn't stop. He gave a neutral nod and walked toward the offices, leaving the impression that he'd been informed of something troubling but not urgent. Malcolm's stomach tightened, not from fear, but from something worse, resignation. He was being categorized without cause, accused without accusation, made to feel like a threat without any overt declaration. A minute later, Lorraine looked up and caught him watching her. Their eyes met for less than a second, but it was enough for her to lift one brow in a gesture of irritation. She returned her attention to her screen, as if his presence itself was a disruption to the workspace. The other tellers adjusted their energy accordingly. Paige began whispering to the person on her headset, eyes glancing toward Malcolm, as if she were reporting a situation. Another teller pulled open a drawer slowly and removed a laminated copy of the bank's incident protocol guide. It remained on the desk, untouched, but deliberately placed. Malcolm remained motionless on the bench. He had not raised his voice. He had not asked for help a second time. He had followed every instruction given. Still, the silence in the bank had begun to shift. A kind of subtle tension now hung in the air, not panic, not alarm, but that quiet suspicion that often precedes the kind of judgment no one will admit out loud. Lorraine continued her work helping a new client, but as she passed the documents across the counter, she smiled and said something else under her breath, just enough for the customer to glance back at Malcolm while pretending not to stare. This time, Malcolm heard the words clearly. They weren't harsh, just a soft comment about someone waiting too long, possibly confused, possibly not understanding the process. It sounded benign, but every syllable had been calculated to reinforce the idea that he was the anomaly, that he was the one who didn't understand how things worked. And the worst part wasn't that it was said. It was how it worked. Because the customer smiled, nodded, and looked at Malcolm with that same expression of concerned pity, the kind that tried to appear generous but was soaked in quiet judgment. Malcolm looked away, back down at the floor, where the base of the bench met the tile. His eyes fixed on the seam between two slabs of marble, and for a moment he imagined the years it had taken for that crack to appear, a slight shift in pressure, a tiny compromise in the foundation, until finally the split became visible. That's how it always started. One moment of subtle pressure, then another, then silence. He had followed every instruction without raising his voice. He had remained seated when told. He had handed over proper documentation without protest. And yet, none of that changed the course that Lorraine had set for him. He was now a man waiting in public silence, being judged without trial. When Lorraine finally called him back to the counter after nearly 2 hours, it wasn't with a smile or apology. It was with a clipboard in one hand and a thin, battered pencil in the other. She didn't offer an explanation before placing the items on the counter with a subtle click, her tone as calm as ever as she informed him that for security reasons, he'd need to fill out an internal background verification form before his transaction could proceed. Malcolm blinked slowly, glancing at the clipboard. The form was unfamiliar. The header bore the bank's name, but looked like it hadn't been updated in years, with faint blue lines and boxes that referred to policies no longer in use. He looked back at her and asked if this was a new requirement. Lorraine responded flatly that it was always used when a check exceeded 5 figures and required reactivation of a dormant account. Malcolm didn't believe her, but he didn't challenge it. Instead, he took the clipboard with both hands, then reached into his coat for a pen. Lorraine shook her head, slid the pencil toward him, and stated with a tight voice that personal pens couldn't be used on internal forms. He hesitated, looking down at the pencil. It was a number 2, its eraser worn to a stub, and the yellow paint was chipped in spirals from years of being chewed. There were bite marks along the shaft, dark and deep, as if someone had used it to vent frustration over a long period of time. Malcolm took the pencil without a word, the weight of the humiliation settling in his chest like wet sand. She then gestured to the side of the lobby, to a narrow ledge beside the ATM alcove. That counter, she said, was available for form completion. There were no chairs there, no privacy, no barrier from foot traffic. He would be standing beneath a vent that pushed out cold air intermittently. In a corner meant more for discarded receipts than paperwork. As he walked to the counter, the janitorial crew rolled their bin nearby. One of them, a man in a blue uniform with earbuds in, popped open the trash can near Malcolm and began replacing the liner. The sour scent of leftover food and paper mixed with cleaning solution, and Malcolm's eyes watered slightly from the sudden sharpness in the air. Still, he began to write. The form asked for his mother's maiden name, the address of the company that issued the check, the name of the issuing officer, the purpose of the deposit, a secondary contact number, and a written declaration that he was not attempting to process funds obtained through fraudulent or illicit means. Malcolm filled each section with deliberate care, his handwriting controlled despite the cold. His fingers stiffened as he gripped the damaged pencil, the graphite smudging slightly as he moved through each box. Customers passed behind him, some staring, some avoiding eye contact altogether. One child asked his father why that man was writing next to the garbage. The father hushed the child and steered him away. Malcolm didn't turn. He kept his focus on the clipboard, completing each line as if it mattered, though he knew the form was a delay tactic. He had worked in systems like this before long ago, in a time when policies were written to exclude without using the word exclude. He had seen these methods applied to people who didn't know how to respond, people who gave up, people who left without depositing their checks. Lorraine knew this tactic well. She knew how to break a client without ever raising her voice, how to wear down their resolve through professionalism so polished it was practically weaponized. When Malcolm returned the clipboard, Lorraine barely looked at the form before sliding it aside. She tapped at her keyboard for less than a minute, then told him she would now begin reviewing the information submitted and that he could return to the bench while she finalized the compliance step. He opened his mouth to ask how long that might take, but she had already moved to her next client. Malcolm returned to the bench, every step a little heavier than the last. His legs ached. His shoulders were sore from holding the plastic bag against his chest for so long. As he sat, the janitorial crew wheeled their bin past him, and the smell of bleach clung to the air behind them. He folded his hands again, resting them on top of the bag, and stared at the door across the lobby, counting the seconds it took each client to be served. Most were gone within 10 minutes, some less. One man walked in, made a deposit, and left all in the time it took Lorraine to review a single field on his form. Time passed differently for Malcolm. It always had. It wasn't just that he was being made to wait. It was that the wait was designed to erode him, to wear down his certainty, his calm, his ability to insist. Lorraine had turned his silence into suspicion, his patience into proof of something wrong. When she finally returned with the clipboard, she placed it on the edge of her desk and called for a supervisor to join her. Her voice remained pleasant, but her words were laced with professional concern. She said the handwriting on the form was uneven, that the issuing agency details weren't specific enough, that the purpose of funds sounded vague. Malcolm heard all of this from the bench. Lorraine returned to her station moments later, her heels making precise, practiced clicks across the tile floor, and without glancing in his direction, she picked up a manila envelope from the drawer beneath her keyboard. She opened it, revealed it to be marked incomplete in faded red ink on the front corner, and began placing his documents into it with a kind of exaggerated slowness that made it clear she wanted others to see what she was doing. She folded the verification form once, then again, pressing each crease flat with her palm, as though ensuring no air remained between the lines. Her face was unreadable, her actions deliberate, and each motion she made seemed tailored to erode the weight of Malcolm's identity down to the thickness of paper. He sat motionless, not because he lacked the will to move, but because every instinct warned him that movement would only be interpreted as defiance. He knew this game, had lived long enough to see how dignity could be chipped away not with insults or slurs, but with the sterile coldness of clerical indifference. Lorraine stood up suddenly, holding the envelope like a toxic sample, and called across the floor, her voice raised just slightly beyond normal speaking level, so it traveled to the mortgage desk and caught the attention of 3 nearby clients. She said the system had flagged a potential conflict in one of the client files, and she would need to consult the assistant branch manager before proceeding with the deposit. Her tone was officious but tinged with judgment, as though she were performing a duty rather than seeking assistance. The phrase potential conflict hung in the air like a warning, vague enough to protect her from liability, but heavy enough to seed suspicion among anyone within earshot. 2 tellers exchanged glances. One man in a tailored sports coat glanced toward Malcolm, his expression tightening slightly as he adjusted the cuff of his shirt. A woman who had been completing a loan application paused mid-sentence to look up. Malcolm felt the heat of their stares crawling across his back, but he kept his face forward, eyes on the black seams between the floor tiles, jaw clenched tight beneath the graying stubble on his chin. Lorraine didn't go to the assistant manager. Instead, she walked past his office door, turned down the hall toward the staff break room, and disappeared. Her absence stretched into 15 minutes. During that time, the envelope with Malcolm's documents remained untouched on her desk, positioned deliberately in view, its label still visible. The word incomplete had not been crossed out, corrected, or updated. It stood as a silent verdict. Paige, the younger teller beside Lorraine's desk, glanced at it occasionally, but said nothing. She served a few clients, avoided eye contact with Malcolm, and once adjusted the angle of her screen to block his reflection from her view. The branch manager, a man in his 50s with a thinning hairline and anxious hands, emerged from the back office during that stretch. He scanned the room, looked toward Lorraine's empty station, then walked over to Paige and asked something quietly. She nodded, whispered a reply, and pointed toward the envelope on the desk. He leaned forward slightly, inspected the front of the folder without opening it, then shook his head slowly and walked away. At no point did he look at Malcolm or speak to him directly. When Lorraine finally returned, she carried a fresh cup of coffee and a phone charger in her hand. She sat down, sipped her drink, adjusted her seat height by half an inch, and pulled up a new screen on her terminal. It was as if the past 30 minutes had never happened. She didn't mention the potential conflict, didn't speak to any manager, and certainly didn't acknowledge Malcolm's continued presence in the lobby. She called the next client to her counter, a man in a navy pea coat with a leather portfolio tucked beneath his arm, and greeted him with such warmth and familiarity that it almost seemed like a completely different person had taken her place. As she processed his transfer, she reached for a complimentary pen from the tray beside her monitor and handed it to him with a smile, the same kind of pen she had denied Malcolm earlier that day when he was told to use a chewed-up pencil for official paperwork. Malcolm stood slowly, his joints stiff and breath measured. He walked to the counter again, his steps quiet, his expression unreadable. Lorraine didn't look up until he was only 2 feet away. When she finally did, she tilted her head slightly and asked if he had been helped already, as if she had no memory of the last 2 hours. He reminded her with calm and clarity that she had taken his documents, assigned him a verification form, and claimed the system flagged a conflict. She replied that she was waiting for authorization to proceed and that someone would be with him shortly. Then she resumed her conversation with the man in the pea coat, dismissing Malcolm with nothing more than a glance and a nod. Malcolm stepped back, his eyes drifting once again to the envelope on her desk. He recognized the corners of his identification card, barely peeking from the stack of papers inside. The label still read incomplete. There had been no system flag. No manager had been consulted. It had all been another tactic, another quiet erosion, designed to break him without a trace. Malcolm turned away and walked back to the bench. He did not sit. Instead, he remained standing, his eyes fixed on the row of teller stations, his mind replaying each step, each maneuver, each precise move Lorraine had made since the moment he stepped into the bank. It wasn't just about a check anymore. Some clients stared just long enough to confirm that they shouldn't be the ones to say something, while others kept their eyes locked on their phones or the floor, pretending not to see the man who had been there longer than anyone else. The weight of his presence had been steadily transformed by Lorraine's quiet campaign, from customer to anomaly, from anomaly to concern. She had not raised her voice. She had not accused him. But she had carefully built an invisible wall around him, brick by silent brick. And now, in this 6th hour of subtle warfare, she intended to fortify it further. Lorraine shifted behind the counter and glanced toward him. Her hand moved toward the desk phone, lifting the receiver slowly, the cord stretching like a wire across enemy lines. She pressed 2 buttons, pausing between them as if initiating something official, and then she spoke, her voice still smooth, still low, but now edged with calculated code. "Yes, I'm going to need eyes on aisle 4, she said with just enough theatrical professionalism that it sounded procedural to anyone who overheard, but clearly pointed toward something specific. Malcolm didn't move. He had heard phrases like that before in stores, government offices, and transportation terminals. Phrases designed not to describe actual locations, but to alert someone somewhere that a presence had been deemed suspect. There were no aisles in the bank. There were desks, counters, and stations, but no aisles. The phrase was not meant to guide anyone. It was meant to assign a label, one that required no evidence. A younger teller, no older than 25, paused mid-transaction and looked toward Lorraine. She nodded slightly in his direction, barely perceptible, then turned her attention back to her screen. The teller blinked, nodded once in return, then picked up a small notepad and began walking a path that took him in a wide circle around the bank floor. Malcolm noticed the first pass immediately. The teller walked slowly past the seating area where Malcolm stood, glanced at the ATM machines, made a show of scribbling something in his notepad, then returned to his desk without stopping. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. But as soon as he sat down, he stood again, this time without the notepad, and began a second walk through the floor, this time pretending to check the printer station by the customer service kiosk. Malcolm watched his movements with quiet intensity. This wasn't loss prevention. This wasn't protocol. It was theater, an improvised act in a play written by Lorraine, designed to create an illusion of danger. On the third pass, the teller didn't even carry anything. He walked empty-handed, pretending to observe the potted plant near the windows, his eyes constantly drifting toward Malcolm as if waiting for a reason, any reason, to justify the charade. A woman near the entrance glanced toward the teller, then at Malcolm, then back again. Her gaze was cautious now, her purse held a little closer to her side. A man at the far end of the lobby leaned slightly toward the security guard posted near the rear door, whispering something before gesturing vaguely in Malcolm's direction. The guard, wearing a gray uniform and standing under a fluorescent light that washed out his expression, made no move but kept his gaze tilted slightly toward the center of the room. Malcolm could feel the shift. Not in the air, not in the temperature, but in the collective posture of the room. It wasn't overt fear. It was caution, subtle but dangerous, fueled not by any act he had committed, but by the way Lorraine had arranged a set. She now returned the phone to its cradle, her fingers brushing the receiver like she'd completed a necessary step in her daily routine. She turned to her monitor and resumed typing, entering lines of data that had nothing to do with Malcolm's account. It didn't matter. The objective had already been achieved. He had become a silent headline in a lobby full of whispers. No one would confront him directly. No one would accuse him of wrongdoing. But no one would help him either. The teller who had circled him returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a sheet of incident report paper. He didn't fill it out. He left it visible on the desk like a placeholder, a signal. Malcolm slowly returned to the bench, his movements deliberate, his chest heavy with the pressure of being treated like a warning sign instead of a man. He hadn't spoken since completing the verification form. He hadn't moved beyond the designated areas. He hadn't raised his voice, demanded answers, or deviated from any instruction given. Still, he was the one being watched, the one being circled, the one triggering invisible alarms based on a judgment that had never been explained, only enacted. Lorraine continued serving clients with her signature blend of efficiency and charm. Her mask remained flawless. When Paige leaned in and asked something quietly, Lorraine responded with a faint smile, glancing toward Malcolm once before shaking her head. Paige nodded and returned to her desk. The conversation had ended, but the message had been received. In the next hour, the janitorial crew returned. The same man who had changed the trash bags earlier now swept the corners of the floor near the ATM where Malcolm had filled out his form. He looked up once, gave a neutral nod, and returned to his work. A woman in a blue skirt suit walked in carrying a child and stood just far enough from Malcolm that the child wouldn't brush past him. The distance was practiced, almost unconscious. She didn't look at him, not out of rudeness, but because she had already determined that looking might provoke something. The envelope with his documents still lay untouched on Lorraine's desk. At one point, she shifted it slightly, turned it sideways, then placed a small paperweight on top. It wasn't to secure it. There was no wind in the bank. It was to mark it, to bury it beneath process. Lorraine Baxter, now firmly entrenched in her role as enforcer of invisible rules, continued to manipulate the process. She had stopped pretending that his file required urgent attention. She had simply allowed it to sit untouched, half buried beneath brochures for credit-building tools and client feedback cards no one ever filled out. Paige no longer looked at him with confusion. She now looked with acceptance, as if everything unfolding was natural, routine. The younger teller who had circled him earlier took a seat near the printer station and began filling out a form titled Unusual Client Tracking. It was left visible, unsigned, unnecessary, but placed with clear intent. Malcolm remained still, his eyes focused, his breath steady, his body now exhausted from the calculated theater being played around him. He had long learned that restraint in public was a form of self-defense, and he had wielded it with quiet discipline all afternoon. But restraint also meant that no one would advocate for him. That changed exactly 30 seconds after Lorraine decided to escalate one final step. As she reached for the envelope marked incomplete, she muttered something under her breath, just loud enough for Paige to hear. "These people always think their old paper makes them important," she said, her tone dry and condescending, the words laced with that special kind of cruelty that hides behind professional language. Paige let out a short breath that might have been a laugh or an attempt to avoid one. Lorraine, encouraged by the response, rolled her eyes and said honestly, "If you can't tell a scam when it walks through the door carrying a grocery bag, you don't belong behind this counter." Paige didn't respond that time. Instead, her eyes flicked toward the entrance. Lorraine didn't notice. She was too busy flipping through Malcolm's paperwork with one hand and sipping her coffee with the other. She held the check up to the light one more time, unnecessarily, then began reaching for the red-stamped cancellation form, the one reserved for checks deemed suspicious, fraudulent, or improperly issued. She didn't hesitate. Her expression was calm, amused even. She was about to stamp the document when a quiet sound interrupted her. The sound of polished leather shoes on marble. Firm, measured, unhurried. The steps stopped precisely at the edge of her desk. Lorraine looked up, her smirk still fresh on her face, until her eyes met the nameplate resting against a dark navy blazer embroidered with a sterling First Bank logo. It read Samuel Roach, Regional Director. He wasn't tall, but he had presence, the kind that didn't need to be announced. He wore a silver pin clipped to the lapel of his jacket, and a leather binder was tucked beneath his left arm. His posture was perfect, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were fixed directly on Lorraine. For a moment, the room held its breath. Paige stiffened, her hands still on the keyboard. The young teller stopped mid-sentence with a client. Even the security guard shifted his stance. Lorraine's smile wavered, but she recovered quickly, assuming her usual professional tone as she began to explain there had been a conflict flag in the system and that she was just following protocol on a questionable check. She emphasized the importance of protecting the bank's assets and ensuring proper compliance. Her voice was smooth, practiced, but she had not yet realized what everyone else had begun to suspect. Samuel Roach turned his head slightly, just enough to glance toward Malcolm, who had not moved from his spot. Their eyes met across the room, one silent, worn, and steady, the other sharp and watchful. Samuel blinked once, then turned back to Lorraine, now looking not at her eyes, but at the envelope she was still holding, the red stamp resting beside it. He nodded toward the folder. "May I see that?" Lorraine hesitated, just long enough to confirm guilt. She handed it over without a word. Samuel opened it with practiced fingers, flipped through the documents with methodical precision, pausing once at the certified check, once again at the county-issued verification letter. His jaw didn't move. His posture didn't shift. But when he closed the folder and handed it back, his voice cut through the room like glass sliding across tile. "This was processed through my office 3 days ago. It's already been cleared by legal. Why is it still sitting here?" Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, but nothing coherent came out. She stammered something about routine verification, that she was waiting on secondary confirmation, that the form had to match internal controls. Samuel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply asked again, softer this time, but with such authority that even Paige leaned away slightly. When he said, "Did you not recognize the name on the account?" Lorraine's breath caught. She flipped through the folder again, this time scanning the fine print with desperate urgency. At the top of the account, the name Malcolm Joseph Roach stared back at her in bold font. Her eyes darted to the regional director. Roach. She swallowed. Her lips parted again, but no words came out. Samuel turned toward the manager's office and called for the assistant branch director, who arrived quickly, flustered, papers in hand. Samuel instructed him to reset the teller queue, remove Lorraine from client service rotation, and begin an immediate internal review of account processing protocol. He then turned back to Malcolm. For the first time that day, someone walked directly up to Malcolm Roach and offered a handshake. Samuel's eyes softened slightly, but he said nothing performative, nothing apologetic in front of the staff. He simply said, "Let's finish this properly." Lorraine stood frozen at her station. Staff who moments ago had treated Malcolm as a background anomaly now found themselves anchored in a very different reality. One where the man they had dismissed with bureaucratic cruelty was no longer invisible, but central, no longer powerless, but personally connected to the authority that governed their careers. Samuel stood still, not wasting a breath. Then, in a tone that did not require repetition, he asked Paige to retrieve the teller activity logs for the past 4 hours. There was no confusion. She rose immediately, crossed to the terminal, and printed out the entries, each one time-stamped, color-coded, and watermarked with teller identification. She handed it to him with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly. He did not thank her. He did not reassure her. He simply took the paper, unfolded it with the same calm he had carried since the moment he entered, and began reading line by line. Lorraine's breathing had become audible now, not panicked, but forced through her nose, her chest rising in shallow bursts. Samuel's eyes moved across the page without comment for the first minute, but the second minute changed everything. His fingers stopped halfway down the sheet, then tapped once against the paper. He turned slightly, just enough to angle the log toward the assistant branch manager, who had taken a post behind him like a deputy awaiting judgment. At 11:04 a.m., it showed that Malcolm's certified check had been logged as received. At 11:06, Lorraine marked the account as pending external verification. At 11:08, the check was physically removed from the envelope, but instead of being scanned, it was manually refiled under the hold category. Samuel asked without looking up, what system flagged this as a conflict? The assistant manager swallowed hard and replied that no conflict alert had been triggered that morning. Samuel nodded once, tapped the sheet again, then said, "Yet this note shows a client was verbally identified as potentially fraudulent at 11:26. Who approved that classification?" Lorraine opened her mouth, but he raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to pause the lie before it formed. She said nothing. He continued down the list. At 11:41, a background verification form was issued. Not standard. The form had not been in use since 2019. He lifted it from the envelope, held it up for everyone to see, and then compared it to the bank's updated client verification protocol printed and laminated at each desk. He pointed out every discrepancy, the unnecessary fields, the outdated language, the intentional misuse of fraud declaration in the footer. The other tellers were silent, their faces taut with a mix of guilt and dread. He turned to Malcolm, who remained still, composed, his eyes forward but distant. bearing the weight of hours spent waiting not for assistance, but for dignity. Samuel's voice remained calm as he continued. He now held up the timestamp showing Lorraine's entry at 12:12 p.m., where she logged a customer observation note flagged, requires monitoring. A term reserved for hostile or non-compliant clients. Yet by all records, Malcolm had never raised his voice, never interrupted, never even left the approved waiting areas. Samuel turned to the security guard, who now stood straighter, and asked if he had been alerted to any disruption. The guard replied, "No, sir, none. Not once." Samuel nodded again. At 12:47, Lorraine made another note in the log, indicating a loss prevention advisory had been initiated. Samuel turned to her then, finally giving her the full weight of his attention, and asked who had authorized that request. Lorraine hesitated. Her fingers gripped the edge of her desk. No name was attached to the advisory. No supervisor had been consulted. Samuel returned to the log. At 1:03, the account was flagged, awaiting further instructions. At 1:05, a call was placed to the internal audit line, but the call duration was only 13 seconds. Too short for any actual exchange. Just enough time to pretend due diligence. He looked at Lorraine, asked no further questions, and yet with every word he read aloud, the framework of her deception unraveled in full view. The staff, previously complicit in quiet compliance, now looked at her with a new distance, as though realizing she had led them into something irreversible. Malcolm remained silent. His stillness now commanded the space in a way Lorraine's performance never could. He had not spoken, had not retaliated, had not corrected the narrative. Yet now, every eye in the bank saw him not as a stranger, but as a measure of their own failure. Samuel placed the log down on the counter, then instructed the assistant branch manager to escort Lorraine to the internal meeting room, where she would remain until a formal incident review could be conducted. Lorraine began to object, something about process, about misunderstanding, about not recognizing the name. Samuel cut her off with a glance, a simple shift in his expression that said everything without a single word. Lorraine's final defense evaporated in her throat. She stepped from behind the counter, her heels quieter now, her posture cracked. As she passed Malcolm, she looked up once. He did not return the gaze. She disappeared through the hallway door, flanked by the assistant manager, leaving the envelope behind. Samuel looked back at Malcolm, then at the desk where the red stamp still lay. He picked it up, turned it over once, then placed it gently in a drawer and closed it. Then, in one unbroken motion, he gathered Malcolm's documents, unfolded them carefully, and fed them through the scanner himself. The terminal processed the check in less than 15 seconds. No errors, no warnings, just an automated ping indicating completion. Samuel printed the receipt, placed it in a fresh envelope, and walked across the floor. The staff made room for him. Clients who had previously looked at Malcolm with suspicion now looked at him with guilt, some averting their eyes, others watching with quiet reverence. The very moment he exited the building, Samuel instructed the assistant manager to seal Lorraine Baxter's desk and requested full access to the security logs, teller communications, and internal call records for the entire week. No one questioned the directive. By nightfall, Lorraine was placed on administrative leave pending internal review. Her employee access was suspended, her work phone retrieved, and her locker secured. The announcement went out quietly through the internal HR system, but the real message had already circulated. There would be no shielding, no covering, and no softening of what had occurred. Samuel did not deliver speech. He did not make grand declarations. Instead, he met with legal and audit officers to outline a timeline for a full integrity audit of branch practices. The bank security department extracted camera footage from 6 separate angles, logging timestamps that matched exactly with the activity log Samuel had reviewed. Every movement, every interaction, every facial reaction was preserved. Lorraine's indifference, Paige's glances, the younger teller's repeated walks past Malcolm. Each frame became a data point in a growing narrative that no longer relied on opinion. The footage alone would have sufficed, but it was the communications log that solidified the verdict. Internal messages between Lorraine and Page revealed the coded language used to signal bias, to mask prejudice behind routine terms like delayed validation, profile mismatch, and walk-in override. These were not policy terms. They were shortcuts, tools used to flag clients who didn't meet someone's private expectations of legitimacy. One message from Lorraine to Page read, "Watch this one, he's got the look. Might be a time sink." Another, sent during Malcolm's 4th hour in the lobby, said, "Still parked. Probably hoping we'll give up. I might stamp it just to shut him down." The bank's audit team compiled these messages into a timeline and linked them to actions taken on the terminal. Not only were Lorraine's choices premeditated, but they were deliberate deviations from bank policy, covered with plausible procedures meant to fool anyone not paying attention. By midweek, Page was called into a private meeting with Human Resources and asked to explain her responses, her silence, and her complicity. She offered no resistance, but she did not accept full blame either. Her statement was that she felt uncomfortable but feared undermining her superior. The bank placed her on conditional review, a status that suspended her promotion track and required compliance retraining. The younger teller, whom the logs showed had been instructed without context, was assigned to a different branch pending behavioral coaching. He hadn't challenged the order to walk the floor, but he had expressed concern afterward, telling a colleague off the record that it felt wrong. That note was documented. He was spared formal reprimand, but advised that future obedience without understanding would not be tolerated. The assistant branch manager, who had watched the entire situation unfold without interference, was not so fortunate. His silence had been compounded by prior complaints on unrelated matters, and the audit team determined his failure to act was part of a larger pattern. He was demoted to customer service lead and relocated to a lower traffic branch without supervisory duties. His office was emptied quietly, his nameplate replaced within 24 hours. Lorraine, meanwhile, received a formal summons to attend a disciplinary hearing within 7 days. She did not respond. 3 follow-up attempts were made, one via certified letter, one via her corporate email, and one through direct phone call. She ignored all of them. On the 8th day, the bank's compliance board issued a default ruling, termination with cause, revocation of benefits pending ethics review, and a permanent bar from re-employment in any regional branch within the Sterling First Network. Her record was updated to reflect procedural abuse, bias-based decision-making, and failure to adhere to standard escalation protocols. Though she had once been a model employee on paper, the review exposed a history of strategic obstruction that had gone unnoticed due to its subtlety. Clients she had dismissed over the years were quietly re-evaluated. At least 3 separate complaints that had been previously marked resolved were reopened. 2 former clients confirmed that their interactions with her had mirrored Malcolm's experience, only they hadn't had the fortitude or connection to push back. The bank's legal counsel issued internal guidance, reminding all staff that no amount of professionalism could justify prejudice cloaked in process. As these changes rippled through the institution, Malcolm remained absent from the public conversation. He never contacted the bank again, never filed a civil complaint, never gave an interview. Samuel received a thank you note 2 days later, not mailed, not delivered, just left at his office with no signature. It read only, "Truth doesn't need noise. It just needs a place to breathe." Samuel placed the note in the bottom drawer of his desk and said nothing to anyone. But in the days that followed, a quiet culture shift emerged. Staff at Sterling First began handling clients with sharper attention to tone and equity. Compliance reviews were no longer treated as box-checking exercises. Anonymous reporting channels were used more often. The plastic barrier that had once sat between teller and client was quietly removed from Malcolm's former branch. Not replaced, removed. Spring had unfolded with reluctant softness in the outer suburbs, the streets no longer brittle with cold, but not yet warmed into bloom. On a corner where once no one lingered, a quiet financial services office operated beneath a fading awning. No logo, no sign. Just a glass door etched with the name of the owner in lowercase letters and a list of services in laminated plastic. Inside, Lorraine Baxter adjusted her collar in the mirror behind the front desk, smoothed the hem of her modest blazer, and resumed sorting grant applications with the methodical precision that had once made her a respected bank officer. Her new office was quieter, smaller, the kind of place people visited only when their options had narrowed. There were no electronic ID badges, no intercoms, no marble floors, and no regional directors. There were only clients, real ones, with worn folders and questions they couldn't answer on their own. She had been working there for just under 6 months, brought in by a former colleague who hadn't asked too many questions about her exit from Sterling First. They had offered her this position under the condition that she keep her name off promotional materials and attend monthly compliance workshops. She had agreed not because she had a choice, but because something inside her had fractured the day she saw the security footage played back to her. She had watched herself dismiss a man for no reason beyond the assumptions she'd carried like armor. She had heard her own voice, measured, calm, and cruel, and there was no undoing the sound of it. That morning, she was preparing materials for a local community outreach session hosted at the public library across town. It was a small event, a room filled mostly with hopeful entrepreneurs, senior citizens, and young people unsure how to interpret loan documents. Her role was to assist quietly, help explain forms, and direct questions to the speakers. She had done 3 of these events before. None had been remarkable, but this one began differently. At first, nothing felt unusual. She entered the room with a cardboard box of folders, set up a folding table with water bottles, and nodded to the coordinator. People trickled in slowly, some in work uniforms, others in casual sweaters, a few with children in tow. At precisely 10:30, the facilitator stood to welcome everyone and explain the schedule. Lorraine stood to the side, arms crossed lightly, trying to appear helpful but neutral, hoping the session would pass without incident. It was during the second half, after the presentation on funding eligibility, that a woman in a green jacket raised her hand and asked in a clear but uncertain voice if anyone in the room could help her fill out the state grant application. The room paused. A few people glanced around. No one spoke. Lorraine reached into the box for a blank copy, preparing to step forward, but stopped when another figure quietly rose from the back row. He didn't raise his voice or make a gesture. He simply stood, folder in hand, and walked toward the front with a quiet confidence of someone not needing permission. Lorraine's chest went still before her eyes fully confirmed what her body already sensed. It was Malcolm Roach. Not in a blazer, not with his brother beside him, not in the sharp light of polished marble, but in a wool sweater, sleeves rolled to the forearms, a pen tucked behind one ear. His posture was calm, his movement unhurried, and when he reached the woman with the green jacket, he smiled gently and said, "Let's take a look together." Lorraine did not move. She did not speak. She simply watched. Malcolm leaned over the form with the woman, guiding her finger across each line, explaining what the field names meant, where to attach the tax information, and what to write if she didn't yet have a business license. His voice carried just enough to be heard by those nearby, not in a performance, but in service. Several others rose and gathered around, drawn not by spectacle, but by clarity. He welcomed them all with the same calm, and soon he was guiding for people through the same form, creating a rhythm that reassured and educated without condescension. Lorraine took a small step backward, not in fear, in recognition. What she saw in him now was what she had refused to see before. She had reduced him to a silhouette based on his coat, his bag, his silence. But here he stood, not with resentment, not seeking retribution, simply teaching, sharing, leading. When the session ended, Lorraine remained by the supply table, pretending to organize remaining forms. She did not expect him to speak to her. He did not. As people left the room, many shook his hand, thanked him, asked if he'd be at the next meeting. He smiled, nodded, and said he'd try. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he stepped toward the door. As he passed her, he looked once, briefly. No malice, no pride, no accusation. Just a glance. Then he was gone. Lorraine stood for a long time after, still holding the edge of the cardboard box, her hands tight against the paper. That night, She returned home to her small apartment above a laundromat and sat at her kitchen table. She didn't eat. She didn't turn on the television. She pulled a blank sheet of paper from her drawer and began writing something she had never thought she would write. Not a letter to Malcolm, not an apology. She wrote a memo, a training memo, titled, "The Difference Between Policy and People." It began simply, "I once believed procedures protected the bank, but they should have protected him." She didn't know where the memo would go. She didn't even know if anyone would read it, but she wrote it anyway. The next day, she handed it to the office owner. A month later, it was included in the orientation packet for all new hires. Months passed. Malcolm became a quiet figure in community spaces, showing up at public sessions, mentoring young applicants, sometimes volunteering at the library on Saturdays. He never brought up what happened. He never used his brother's name, but his impact grew. People knew him. People trusted him. And slowly, quietly, the damage that had been done was not erased, but reformed into something meaningful. Not because he forgave, but because he moved forward with purpose. And Lorraine, once the author of Silent Humiliation, became someone who listened more than she spoke. She did not claim transformation. She did not claim redemption. But when a young intern in her office asked how to decide whether a client was trustworthy, she responded not with a rule, but with a story. About a man who waited 6 hours without protest. About a check that needed no verification. And about the moment she realized that professionalism without humanity is just another form of blindness. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more dramatic, thought-provoking narratives that explore justice, redemption, and powerful character arcs, make sure to like and subscribe to stay updated. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot and the twists leading up to the reveal? Did the ending hit the mark for you? Let me know where you're watching from and what part of the story struck you the most. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one.